digital transformation for some years, like a bank or a telco, or these companies are quite mature in some kind of a digital transformation curve. We've been able to adapt pretty quickly. Then you've got born in the cloud businesses like Uber and Jumia and these e-commerce businesses and ride-hailing businesses and stuff. These are also born that way. So they didn't need to digitally transform. They're born digital businesses. So business has been, to a certain extent, able to pivot, but not every business has been that far down, the digital transformation journey. But it was the human behavior that changed with people who are used to getting in the car and driving through the traffic and going to the office. We were forced to stay at home. We were forced to not only join these incessant video calls that we're doing right now, but we were forced to start signing documents online, start doing more on email, start doing our business in a digital way. So this is what the human coronavirus accelerant is all about. We had the tools at our disposal to do this thing, and we in Liquid we're a multi-country organization. We've been used to doing this collaboration online a lot, but we saw it in the first 3 weeks of our offices, starting with the UK and then progressing to Africa, closing down. We saw this uptake in people collaborating online using these collaboration tools. Really, really big. We see from the infrastructure point of view, we've seen internet traffic shifting from business using internet in the business to do your stuff when you're in the office. People using it at home. There's been a shift in the way internet traffic has gone. It's been able to handle it. The infrastructure's been ready. However, I've talked about e-commerce, which has seen this, a big kicker up and in uptake, as well as the things you mentioned, Henny, and education and health. But really, it is in the space of education that we've seen perhaps the biggest exposure of a digital divide. So if you are a child who has, or a teacher who's working in, or a pupil of a private school in Nairobi, you probably have a decent computer network and a fast internet connection, and you've probably got broadband at home and devices and phones to access the internet. Those children have been able to go home and keep on learning, and those teachers have been able to, from somewhere, keep on teaching. But if you are a pupil or a teacher in a rural school somewhere in Marsabit County, you probably had no learning or teaching whatsoever. There has been a fallback to radio and television, but that is not interactive, and self-paced learning doesn't work for inference. But we have, as Liquid Telecom, we provided internet to about 300 public schools in Kenya under a project from the Universal Service Fund, and we've been mostly they're in Western Kenya, and we've really been able to work with the teachers, starting with the ICT teachers, moving on to other subjects, using the ICT teachers to train other teachers. We've been able to bring on industry partners, Microsoft, Cisco, Kenya Internet Domain Registry, Kennick, other local companies and edutech companies as well, Angaza, Ilimu, and others. We've been able to expose these companies, connect them up with teachers, use these digital tools, and we've really seen, where infrastructure is there, the teachers are able to do this. Digital schools are rising. So where infrastructure and broadband is there, the pivot is possible, the skills can be developed. Where infrastructure isn't there, no learning at all.
Thanks, Ben. In other words, what I hear you saying is the availability of infrastructure is indeed a divide between those that are able to utilize and those who are not able to utilize. Thank you very much. Let's go over to Cami. So Cami Veldemariam is the head of research at Africa Labs for IBM. He's, I think, normally based in Nairobi as well. And he's been really burrowing away at the forefront of big data, AI, blockchain, these technologies that are facilitating much of the digital world and business models now. And the IBM lab has really been closely linked to expanding these technologies into areas like education, healthcare, there's trade logistics. He's been working on climate, there's food supply chains. The pandemic has disrupted supply chains. Cami, I mean, you do the research, but you also have practical solutions. You've got a number of patents registered. So what's your take on what has happened here and is happening here?
Thank you, and good afternoon, and good morning for some of you. And yeah, thanks. So maybe I start introducing myself, right? So I'm Komi. Just on top of what you said, I'm Ethiopian. I lived everywhere, I would say, and I have been working with IBM for the last 8 years. And before that, I was a professor, and before I was entrepreneur. So I have been in the space of digital technology, be it in education, healthcare, agriculture, and so forth. And that actually, what you see that the patents that I filed over 250, which is a result of the innovation I've been working on in this space. So when coming to the topic of rural education, I think I agree with what Ben said. Infrastructure is the key for digitization. So what I have been experiencing for the past several years, in particular in the space of education, is really go back beyond before COVID-19, right? So you have seen around the world there's a significant shift toward technology-enabled blended learning, right? Where a student learns at least in part and at the brick and mortar facility and through online delivery means, with some student control over time, space, and path or pace of the learning process themselves, right? So, however, what you really see that these different modes of learning are not well integrated, and this leads to what we call fragmentation of the overall learning teaching experiences, right? Now, that coupled with the lack of infrastructure, be it at the core hardware level, or at the communication level, or at the even content digitization level, caused a lot of drama among the education ecosystem. And glad Ben mentioned Limo and all other players. And back 2012, I kicked off a project, what we call Cognitive Learning Companion for African classrooms. So the idea was really what we see there may be limited or no information sharing between traditional classroom learning, which is delivered by human teachers, and outside classroom learning using unautomated tutoring. What you see, this proliferation of startups being pop up to do the such learning technologies. So online systems and kind of are often perceived as an additional burden. But this is what we see. We have studied across the educational sector, an additional burden that lacks context, and rather than a natural partner that provides real value added and actionable insight to the teacher, who basically controls the learning pathway for the students. And at times, what happens is that issues of control over the teaching process may cause computer-mediated learning, which is what we call the ICT-mediated learning, to be even perceived as a threat, with human teachers being replaced. That is a question being asked. So when you're introducing the digital technologies and digital means for the teacher, there's always a perception that will human teachers be replaced. So ultimately, this challenge can have a disruptive influence on the overall learning process and leads to what we used to call it the suboptimal outcome. So are you achieving partial learning or full learning? So, and there's a confusion what we are learning in this digital era, a mix of core technology versus learning, right? So if you are most of us here are educators, if you think of education as a digital enabled technology, so what these two things cannot go separate, what we call affective and cognitive processing learning, right? So learners' state is a combination of a cognitive and affective components, right? So which is considerably in the research committee, in the technology committee, what you have seen is a focus on cognitive aspect. What skills are the students trying to learn? What prior skills do they have? What is their current level of competency level, concept level, understanding level. What content and assessment should they do to next based on what they learn? So how digital technology basically facilitating this. So today what you see is really, are you digitizing the entire process of learning and teaching? Are you digitizing the content? Are you digitizing providing ICT support for the teacher and the students? What are you digitizing? So these are all the questions being really didn't get answered before COVID era. Now COVID actually proved these problems go worse, right? The digital divide being at the soft computing level becoming wider, at the core infrastructure level becoming wider, as been said. So the nuanced understanding of this affective process in learning and their interplay with the cognitive process is a holistic approach toward learning. Learning digitalization cannot be really developed without really going round in the value-driven smart partnership, we call it. Partnership is involving the government, private sector, and policymakers to actually come together to in this shifting the digital education era to think beyond actually infrastructure innovation, try to remove the traditional burning of time and space and simplifying the access to content experience. And this requires a learning and relearning to teachers and students and the ecosystem, making this interaction and engagement the centerpiece of what we call the new learning experience beyond really merely on just digitization and infrastructure. So I will stop there. And that's what my point I was trying to make is we really need to come together from different point of view. But I think beyond technology, when we talk about learning, what does it mean? That's my comeback here. So,
Kobe, thank you very much for that, challenging us on what learning means with all its facets. Let me introduce Eliane Ubalijoro. She's the Professor for Practice for Public-Private Sector Partnerships at McGill University. She's deeply engaged in Rwanda, where she's on the National Science and Technology Council and the Presidential Advisory Council. She helps the African Development Bank as part of an expert global community of practice on COVID-19. And as I've discovered, she's a very keen discussant. Eliane, your take on all of this?
So, thank you. I just want to say I'm also the Deputy Executive Director for Global Open Data in Agriculture and Nutrition. And so the work, my day job at GODAN, the acronym for Global Open Data in Agriculture and Nutrition, is how can digitalization help us ensure food security and nutrition around the world? So COVID-19 has been a huge setback in terms of the SDGs, the goals we have towards 2030. And what we know is that of the 800 million people who were food insecure before COVID-19 hit, is that the risks are this will reach 1.2 billion people who go hungry every day, and above the 800 million. There's 2.7 billion people before COVID-19 who are food insecure, and 800 million who went hungry every night. And that 800 million may go up to 1.2 billion. And so digitalization is a critical element in the agricultural food chain in terms of how are we connecting logistically, how are we bringing knowledge to farmers to ensure that they have adequate information to know when to plant, when to harvest, how to minimize inputs so that not only are they able to maximize productivity, but also make sure that the environmental impact of their production is minimized. What we know is that agricultural related inputs and energy costs are a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so part of it is how digitalization can help us improve sustainability in agriculture is critical. And so what we have seen is that in places in Africa where farmers were connected, were able to negotiate loans on phones, were able to transact to buy seeds digitally, they have been able to continue work as usual. And in places where this hasn't been possible, this has really affected logistically their capacity to produce, to bring food to market and reach customers. And we also know that the lockdown has been really critical. So what COVID-19 has done in terms of the food security space is really accelerate the urgency of connecting all smallholder farmers in the world to value chains, to consumers, so that we can ensure that the most smallholder farmers, there's over 570 million smallholder farmers in the world. They produce 75% of the food that we eat. And so having them connected is a really critical element for global food security. And as we move from a billion population in Africa to 2.6 billion by 2050, this is going to become more and more critical. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. On the weekend, I was on a FAO China agricultural digitalization event, and the work that Alibaba has been doing to connect farmers to value chains to customers is amazing in terms of being able to predict what to plant, how much of it, and to ensure that customers and farmers are linked in the most effective way to minimize post-harvest losses and to also ensure flow in terms of logistics. And so Alibaba is able to have farmers get loans approved over the phone digitally in 3 minutes. And so how can we bring that level of digitalization to Africa to ensure that our smallholder farmers who contribute, agriculture contributes 30% to GDP in general in Africa. And so what we know is when farmers have access to digital technologies to guide them in terms of productions and access to markets and weather data in terms of planning, they can increase their incomes up to easily 30%. So it's really important that we look at how this can increase our capacity for agricultural productivity and also adding value along the food chain. So I see this as a really critical element. And because women play a huge part in agriculture in Africa, access to digitalization skills for women is even more important. And so GoDan has about 1,100 partners around the world, and half of those are in Africa. And what's important to us is how can all of those partners, whether they're from private sector, public sector, startups, or large organizations, is how can they support this space of digitalization, skills development, and infrastructure. So I'm just going to just share one story. One of the GoDan partners, AgLedger, has been working using blockchain to connect farmers to markets, and not only have been able to increase farmer income by 4 or 5 times, but they've also been able to look at whenever produce wasn't of the needed quality, how can that be used in other ways to ensure that there is a cycle that takes everything and there is no more waste in the system. And so this is a really important issue because whatever isn't used for agriculture can be used for any energy production, for compost, so fertilizer production. What can be sold at high premium because of the quality can be labeled and followed through blockchain across the value chain. And for farmers, as soon as these different steps are met, they can be paid immediately. And so this helps them planning in the long term. And so what we see is that as we look at the future of how we're going to feed the planet sustainably and meet the Sustainable Development Goals, digitalization is a really critical element at all levels of production, of how we face climate change, and how do we put enabling policies to support this needed infrastructure and skills development for youth to enter the space of agriculture. In Africa right now, the average age of a farmer is 59 years old. So it's really critical that we bring more youth to the space, especially that half of the workforce around the planet by 2035 is going to be African. And so we really need to have that digitalization space connect our food systems to youth, to our capacity to produce food and have sustainable solutions that help Africa mitigate climate change. So I really see this space of digitalization, skills development, and infrastructure really important for Africa right now, crucially because of COVID.
Thanks, Eliane. Did you say that the average age of farmers in Africa was about 59? Was that,
yes.
Did I hear you correctly?
Yes. We have an aging farming population, and this is something we urgently need to change because young people don't see farming as exciting. And so if we can associate digitalization to farming. This is a way to really transform the system and make young people more connected. And so this is why I see the areas of AI and blockchain being brought to the space of agriculture are ways to be connected. And that's why, for me, the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences is a really important element in this space, and training all these young people to be able to solve the solutions. That is a really critical one. How do we feed Africa is important, and how do we make agricultural sexy through digitalization is a really critical one that I'm passionate about too.
Now, that's great. As a farmer, I was just trying to check whether I'm adding or detracting from the average, but I won't go further into that. Thanks, Eliana. So let's go to Annabelle Schiff. She's a director with Caribou Digital, which is a firm that provides, I think, a variety of advisory services and strategy services in the area of inclusive digital economies. She worked a lot on digital platforms before, and probably still does. The pandemic kicked in. We got connected in that regard. Annabelle, give us an idea of your take on this digitalization topic. And platforms is obviously a crucial business model in the digital economy.
Yeah, thanks, Henny. And great to hear, lots of different perspectives coming in from lots of the panelists. But as you mentioned, lots of the work that we've been doing at Caribou Digital is focused around kind of digital platforms and the opportunities that they're providing in terms of kind of creating meaningful, fulfilling job opportunities for young people across sub-Saharan Africa. I'll just mention two projects which relate to these discussions around kind of digitalization and skills development and some of the kind of insights that we've seen coming out. The first one is around a project that we called platform-led upskilling. And what we did through this research project was we spoke to a number of global and local platforms to understand a bit more about the role that they were playing in the skills, especially digital skills development landscape in Africa. And we spoke to these platforms to understand a bit more about why, how, and to what effect they're investing in training the small-scale vendors and self-employed workers that earn a living across their platforms. And this is obviously outside of the kind of employer-employee contracts. So it's really interesting to kind of dig down on why they're investing so much in training. And two of the kind of main findings that we found was that all platforms are investing heavily in training, even though it's very hard, it's very expensive, especially pre-COVID, lots of this training was happening face-to-face. But it was, essential to business, especially in regions where there are significant skills gaps. What we also found was that these platforms aren't just investing in training in what we call platform proficiency, which is, how to navigate the platforms that they're working on, but they were also investing in training on digital skills, which links to platform proficiency, but also what we call more broadly kind of skills for a digital age, so soft skills, financial literacy skills, etc. And I think what this really does is it highlights the fundamental kind of skills gaps that exist amongst those in the workforce and those about to enter it. And so that was the platform-led upskilling project that we're still running, and we've been really interested to look at kind of how platforms have responded to COVID and obviously kind of the restrictions on face-to-face training and how they've been responding in that effect. But more recently, we've also been working on a project continuing on this kind of focus on platform workers and platform business models. And what we've done is since March, we've been speaking to a range of platform workers across Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana to understand how the pandemic has impacted their lives and livelihoods. And I think, Ben and some of the other panelists have spoken about kind of, some of the digital tools existed, and obviously there's been a kind of a push in terms of kind of infrastructure development during the pandemic. And, the shift from, for example, going to the office to working from home has been easy for some. So that kind of transformation or that kind of shift has been easy, and often there's been lots of kind of excitement around the introduction of digital platforms and opportunities that they present. But what we've noticed in speaking to these platform workers is kind of access to these online platforms and these digital means of work aren't necessarily a kind of panacea to some of the challenges that others have faced during the pandemic. So just to kind of give you a couple of examples, when we spoke to platform workers or platform sellers that sell their goods via social media platforms or e-commerce platforms, obviously, people thought there was an opportunity in terms of people being able to shift their work online. But what we saw is that often, supply doesn't necessarily match demand. There was the pandemic has affected consumers. There was less commerce for non-essential goods, and also lots of businesses shifted online. So there was this kind of competition that we saw there. Obviously, not all platforms have fared well, with kind of stay at home and kind of restrictions on movements, ride-hailing platforms, place-based platforms that, rely on face-to-face interaction. So those that kind of connect people with carpenters or cleaners have really suffered. And then even freelancing platforms, lots of people looking to these kind of Upworks and Fivers to try and find online work. What we found from speaking to these freelance workers is, they've experienced reduced hours, cancelled contracts, and just in general, just a decrease in the ability to access work. And perhaps, these insights aren't necessarily about the digital divide per se, but more about kind of the reality of digital transformation and the kind of impact that COVID has had, and looking at kind of both the opportunities and challenges that digital platforms present.
Thanks, Annabelle. Thank you very much. So just looking at the questions that are rolling down the side, Komi, I'm going to come to you because there's a fantastic question here. And it's really this. Would you say, that's us as the panel, that increasing access to the content experience includes using African languages in teaching and education? And I mean, if I can rephrase it slightly, it's more than just education. Can I put it this way? Can digital technology, in its ability to digitize our languages and give us voice recognition, help us to leapfrog some of our educational challenges and economic challenges in the same way that mobile helped us to leapfrog the landline challenges? So can our ability to digitize and do voice recognition help people who, for example, in agriculture, cannot read and write in English or cannot read and write at all, engage economically? And I mean, we had a brilliant example last year where the winner of a continent-wide hackathon was a small group of students from the University of Cape Town who had developed a model whereby people could transact using voice via WhatsApp with banks who were illiterate potentially. I mean, that's an exciting opportunity. So, Komi, I'm coming to you. You spoke almost about the technology of education and the modalities. What's your view on this?
That's very interesting and also intriguing question, actually. So, just let me give you an edge, just even to make that a question more complex, right? So, if you look at today the state of content what are available in our education system. When I say education here, not just formal education, classroom setting. I'm also referring to Elaine's point, also agriculture education, right? Education really is it's cross-disciplinary, right? So if you just give an example in the classroom for the students, an example of hot dog, right? So the analogy of hot dog is the Western analogy, right? And that doesn't translate to anything. And now imagine that translating that into a local context. What does it mean, right? So come to agriculture. When you tell to the farmer, most farmers are illiterate, what we experience it in our agriculture for the last couple of years. So you tell, okay, you need to plow this farm in a wet and moisture level of this and the soil property of that, and this inch should go down for the plowing disc to go. So on what planet really the farmer understand what you are saying? So knowledge being lost, right? So what is important is that I think for the person here, we brought up this question. This is analogy, what we call analogy-based learning, right? So how do you actually take that a proper analogy that the farmer basically in a local indigenous or contextualized way he can understand. How can we translate? Let's say an example of 10-inch or maybe put that most of the chatbots today or AI support technology say, okay, put X amount of water or X gallon of water for this part of the farm. And what does that mean? Can you translate that in the voice recognition way? Okay, put let's say X jar of water, which is in milliliter. You need to translate that in a more contextualized way, in a more analogy way to the farmer that he can translate or she can translate to the local context. So yeah, it's important to incorporate indigenous knowledge and localized content into our education system, regardless of education at the agriculture, education at the school level, education at the healthcare facilities. Today, we spoke about blockchain. So how do you actually describe the concept of anonymity versus privacy to someone who is basically giving you the consent into your healthcare technology, right? So the concept of consent is not perceived by the majority of our population in Africa. What does it mean? What does consent mean? Providing data access mean? What does privacy mean? That these are all foreign-born concepts. How do you actually translate that in the local and indigenous way, in a more actual appealing way such that they can actually understand and articulate and then act on it for a better progressive future?
Thanks, Kwame. I like that a lot. So, Eliana, I'm going to zoom into you. So, as somebody who's really looking at agriculture and the notion that digital technologies can bring people into the value chain in ways that they've never done it before, have you come across applications where local language capability and the ability to do that digitally has assisted?
So there are many startups working in this space in Africa, in different countries, and there are applications that are using that. And you also mentioned WhatsApp and being able to use video. So for people who are illiterate, being able to use WhatsApp and just presenting their products through videos on WhatsApp has been a great way to transcend the barrier of literacy. And so, and I also put in the chat box the Lacuna Fund that has been doing a lot of work around funding related to natural language processing and how this can be really important in terms of ensuring that spoken and written languages that are beyond the traditional languages used, beyond English and Indo-European languages, are prevented from having breakthroughs that are based on NLP technologies. So funding is available to encourage this space. There are startups that are working in this area, and what's important is really how do we ensure that the people who are eager to fill the gaps in those areas are connecting. So for example, Digital Green has done a lot of work around digitalization and videography in terms of education in the agricultural space. They started out in India, but have been working in Ethiopia, and I think they've also been working in Kenya. And so part of it is how are we connecting all of the people who are interested in ensuring that language isn't a barrier, but actually is something that helps us enrich this space and ensures that all the different languages that are available that are given access. And in a way, we look at biodiversity and biodiversity loss. Languages are important forms of diversity that need to be cultivated so that we can ensure that we're getting diverse ways of looking at things. And so this is a really critical element. And for people who are looking for funding, that's why I put the Lacuna Fund. And for the others also interested in digitalization and agriculture, just as you were talking, I was going to type in, and I'll put it in, a link to a call with the Gates Foundations around digitalization and agriculture coming up in February. And so there's 2 levels of funding around $100,000 and for pilots and $2.5 million for scale-ups. So there's funding out there. It's really important to stay connected. Rockefeller has the data challenge, a huge program that they launched in the summer for $10 million. $10 million. Around how are we using data to make sure that marginalized communities aren't being left out, and ensuring jobs of the future in terms of youth. So these are really important spaces that are complex, and it's how to ensure that we keep connecting people to accelerate how these skills can really help and be anchored in indigenous languages.
Thanks, Ileana. Ben, I want to come back to you and slightly change course. So I was very interested in your contribution at the outset, how you saw, as the pandemic ensued, more household usage, perhaps less business usage initially, and I think that happened when people moved to their homes. But that triggered a question for me. I mean, what do you think is the relative contribution that that business, the private sector, government, and households have to make to the expansion of infrastructure? Because I don't buy it that this is only a government responsibility. In fact, for many households, a lot of the engagement with the internet is entertainment, quite frankly. It's not necessarily business. So what do you see in where this burden of expanding infrastructure is falling?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, when it comes to Africa, nearly all of the infrastructure which is powering the digital economy has been, built by private sector, and it's whether it be telcos, it doesn't have to be telcos, but they've had a large part in it. We obviously we specialised in fibre optic infrastructure. And we've put in data centers, and then people are bringing cloud to these data centers, and this is some enabling technologies. All becomes infrastructure. But then we look into mobile money and the mobile this is a transformative technology, and 10 years ago was an innovation, but now the mobile payment platforms in Kenya, Zimbabwe, where they're quite dominant in terms of the economic drivers of making payments across the country. Their infrastructure also. These platforms become infrastructure. And as we get more and more digital platforms going on top of, starting with fiber, data centers, and then cloud and these other things, mobile money, they add on, right? So when we come to e-commerce in Africa is taking off very slowly, but largely being enabled by those pioneers in the space, setting up networks of motorbike guys, pickies or bodas, we call them, but guys on motorbikes delivering stuff, and those companies in the e-commerce space have had to build those networks using digital platforms to track where they are and track when the goods are arriving and stuff like that. But these digital platforms then become further layers of infrastructure. In the absence of stuff like addressing schemes, proper physical addresses, digital platforms and pins and coordinate-based digital platforms becoming part of a lacking digital address system. Where we're missing and governments need to pull up their socks is in digital identities. Government have not built broadband, have not built mobile money. India's built all of these themselves. The government has pushed to build a lot of these infrastructures. But governments need to catch up on some of these things and focus on digital identities and some of these enabling technologies. But I also want to, in connecting people is really important, and the mobile phone is a device which is the device that most people own first of all to get on the internet. So it's important that people get this is their first device, and then get further devices like a laptop and other devices that they might access these technologies with. But globally, there are more connected things than there are connected people. So there's about 20 million connected IoT devices, 20 billion IoT connected devices globally for about 6.5 billion people. In Africa, we're seeing that's way less, and in Kenya, maybe it's 1 million connected devices to about 45 million population. So really, really low, but really picking on a lot of stuff Eliane was talking about, and a lot of stuff we've been doing is around, we put out a network of network especially for IoT devices, so that farmers and farming can be transformed by having lower cost devices, lower cost soil probes, weather stations, things to automate pumping and irrigation. These don't necessarily have to be things that are purely done by farmers. You're sending them information, they're sending you information back. It's not just person to person information. If you have machines collecting the information and taking the actions automatically, not only does it make the information more correct, it saves the farmer time. And if you can, farmers in many ways, they're not poor, they're rich, right? In the lives they have, they may well be, you could look at them and say they're having a rich life, but they're poor on time. And they might spend this many hours a day doing this particular function, pulling up water, doing this. If you can automate that and say, okay, well, let's have a soil probe. We'll measure that when he's watering, we'll automatically pull up water when it's required and irrigate. If that can save the farmer 4 hours a day that he might even have been doing, or he or she might have been doing when they didn't even need to, then they have more time to get on the internet and get educated about more things. So, and really, Eliane, this thing about making technology in farming, making it sexy for youth. So I so agree with that. And I was presenting earlier this year at a group, some of the winners from last year's Young Scientists Kenya, which is also ongoing. The 2020 exhibition is ongoing this week. But I was presenting at some of those, and I was asked the question, what would you be doing now if you weren't doing what you're doing? And having been in Kenya 7 years, the obvious thing that jumped out to me, I said I'd be a farmer, right? It's the most obvious thing that you'd be doing. And these kids, all of them 17 to 18, they gave me a round of applause just for saying this. And I couldn't believe it. But the fact that people in technology are interested in farming and implying technology in farming is making it very interesting for people who would not have been thinking about this career before. So I'm really, really Eliane on that.
So Ben, you are starting the farming is cool movement by the sounds of it. Together with Eliane, I mean,
farming is cool. And I didn't understand it when I got to Kenya. I asked somebody who was bright in our organisation. I said, what are your career aspirations? She told me I want to be a farmer. I said, what? What's wrong? Then I've been here 7 years now, right? But I didn't get it when I first arrived.
Fantastic. All right. No, it's working. I mean, believe it or not, we've got 3 minutes left, but I want to, Annabelle, and I want to help George to catch up with his timeline. But Annabelle, I've got a question for you. It's, what the digital world is doing, it's making so much of what was always invisible in Africa visible. So who do you think on the digital side is leading the visualization of Africa, the coming onto the formal economy of Africa? Do you think it's the platforms? Is it the financial sector? Is it social media? Who's leading the data revolution for us in Africa?
Sorry, trying to get myself off mute. That's a very good question. Sorry?
No, please carry on. Yeah.
Can you? Okay. No, I was just gonna say that's a great question. And I think there's lots of really exciting kind of innovations happening, across the finance sector, across platforms. I think social media is something that is definitely, and I saw a question in there around kind of social media in the ag sector, and I think that's something that we really should keep an eye on. I mean, lots of the work that we've been doing is around digital platforms, and often people look at the platforms that have been developed, for business use. So, e-commerce platforms, ride-hailing platforms, and often what is, traditionally social media platforms are developed for kind of entertainment or social purposes per se. But what we've been increasingly is lots and lots of business activity happening through these social media platforms, be it huge farming Facebook pages to big kind of buying and selling groups. And I think what's really interesting in terms of again kind of relating back to this whole question around kind of access to digital infrastructure and tools, there's a much lower barrier to entry on these social media platforms. You know, you don't have to be a formal business. Anyone can join. You know, the digital literacy requirements are arguably lower. It's a tool that people are more accustomed to using in their day-to-day lives. So the transition to use it for business use is a lot easier. And so a lot of kind of increasingly a lot of interesting business transactions and activities are happening over these social media platforms, from Facebook to WhatsApp, Telegram, etc. So I think keeping an eye on what's happening on these platforms is going to be really interesting. And you know, if we are able to capture a bit of the kind of data and activities that happen there, I think we'll reveal lots of interesting kind of insights and future developments.
Right. Thanks, Annabelle. And I think you're entirely right. The digitization of business in Africa is far more advanced, and African people are unbelievably innovative in using these, even what's seen as low technology models, to become very savvy in the business world. So, George, your appearance visually is telling me that I need to wrap this up. So thank you very much to all of our four panelists. Eliana sitting in Canada, Ben digitizing and rolling out infrastructure when he's able to get into Africa. Komi, I've got, I think, days of conversation on education. You really triggered that extremely well. And Annabelle, the platforms fascinate me, but I think you're right. Social media is probably leading the way if we can capture what's going on there. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Digitalization will accelerate. We've got that guarantee from the pandemic. Thank you for your contributions. George, we're only 1 minute over. Do we get a prize?
Thank you very much to the panelists. I think the prize goes to Ben, Eliane, Annabelle, and Komi, no? Well, and you too. More so for not dropping the average. I heard you guys talking about the average age of farmers. Was it 59?
Yes.
And you were saying you were about to...
I'm dropping the age. I'm not increasing it. So I'm on the youthful side. I'm cool like Ben, you see.
Yeah, like Ben. Yeah. So just a lot of crucial things were mentioned. I'll just highlight 5. 1 was the average age of farmers. 2, Alibaba approving digital loans in 3 minutes. That's why huge economies are, like killing it at the moment. So that's something we need to work on. Increasing access to content experience. Of course, the language issue. We see it as a different sign of diversity that needs to be cultivated. That was crucial. We have more connected things than people. That was a very crucial point. And then farmers are rich but poor on time, mainly because a lot of systems, processes aren't automated. So there's a lot more that you said. I was writing until my finger hurt. There was so much from you, valuable stuff. So Ben, Eliane, Annabelle, Komi, and of course Henny, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you. Right. So what's going to happen now? We have a quick 12 minutes. Henny did the best session I've seen today, at least, because we were held up on time. So it's just 3 minutes over. People are going to network until top of the hour. So it's just about 12 minutes. And then what's going to happen, we'll have parallel session 1 with 2 breakout sessions. That's going to happen at, that's 5 p.m. Kenyan time, 4 p.m. Rwandan time. Breakout session 1 will be tapping into the virtual workforce to stimulate youth transition to employment, with a moderator as Dr. Peter, the Senior Program Coordinator at AIMS Canada. At the same time, we'll have another breakout session that is going to highlight top COVID-19 innovations from Africa, with a highlight on entrepreneurs and researchers. So I know a lot of people keep saying COVID-19 has had a very heavy impact on a lot of people, but out of the rough has come some amazing innovations. So the moderator for that conversation will be Salar Chagpar from Canada. After that parallel session, we'll have the NEF Fellow Spotlight session, just a video showing the third group of NEF Fellows, the class of 2019 to 2021. And then after that, we'll have our final parallel sessions. So breakout session 1 and breakout session 2. But I will come back to speak more about it. So for now, please go to the lounge and engage as much as possible. We'll be back in just 10 minutes. So when you see the sessions open up, just go there to the breakout session that you want to get into. So I'll see you later, much, much, much later.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us in this truly global event. We welcome you. Today's session is talking about innovations from Africa that are tackling the situation we're all in with the COVID-19 situation, highlighting entrepreneurs and researchers. I'm joined today by my esteemed panelists, starting with Dr. Abel Mogo. Um, Dr. Mogo is a research associate at the epidemiology unit at the University of Cambridge, and her mission is to promote development that enables human and planetary health through research, innovation, and collaboration. She's worked on global public health projects in diverse contexts. That includes North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and with a prolific array of organizations, including governments, academia, uh, international organizations, venture-funded startups, and civil society. She's also a researcher at the Global Diet and Activity Research Network at the University of Cambridge. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Mogo.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Next, I'd like to introduce Foster Ofosu. He leads knowledge, innovation, and capacity development at the Africa Development Bank. Foster is currently leading the integration of ICT and digital tools into the capacity building efforts for Africa. He was also named one of the top 100 Africa movers and shakers in online learning in 2008. Foster serves as a board member of the International Council on Badges and Credentials. Foster is a passionate individual about internationalization in education. Foster, thank you so much for joining us. Last but not least, Daniel is the CEO of Cape Bio and is a scientist who specializes in structural biology. He's trained in protein engineering and crystallography, bioprocess engineering, and biomanufacturing. Daniel strongly advocates for science that creates jobs, alleviates poverty, contributes to economic development. He's also the CEO of Cape Biotechnologies, a South African biotech firm that recently pivoted to creating PCR testing kits for COVID-19. Cape Bio's core business involves developing molecular diagnostics. Daniel, welcome and thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you, Salah. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Well, before we start this panel, I'd like to let the audience know as we go through and have this conversation around COVID-19 innovations in Africa, feel free to, under the session section in the top left corner, post any of your questions. And as we go through the session, we'll be sure to address those questions and make sure that we can get to them as well. So feel free to use that box. And, it's always good to hear about the diverse experiences. We have Dr. Mogo joining us from the UK, Cambridge, Daniel joining us from South Africa, and Foster